The brutal bite of February 2nd, 1943, it clawed at the face of the world, etching itself into history as the day Stalingrad, that charnel house of dreams and ambitions, officially fell. Or so the meticulously crafted narratives would have you believe. Textbooks, those often sanitized versions of reality, declared the collapse of the last stronghold of the defeated army in the northern ruins. Friedrich, a man burdened by his title and the sheer weight of failure, had yielded. Over 90,000 souls drained of vitality, shivering with cold remnants of a once unstoppable war machine, were marched into the frigid embrace of captivity. A tidy, almost elegant conclusion, a narrative arc resolved. But history, like a wounded beast, often bleeds inconvenient truths. It whispers forgotten details, details most conveniently overlook, burying them beneath layers of propaganda and self-serving pronouncements. The uncomfortable reality, the shadow lurking behind the triumphant parades and pronouncements of victory, was that thousands upon thousands of combatants, their uniforms tattered, their resolve unbroken, refused to succumb. Soviet archives, documents often dismissed or sidelined in Western accounts, reveal a staggering number, over 11,000. They chose not submission. They sought no refuge in the shadows. Instead, they burrowed into the ravaged landscape. They transformed the skeletal remains of a city into a fortress of defiance. What followed was not the orderly process of pacification, but a desperate and bloody campaign against pockets of resistance. Pockets that were not isolated individuals, not remnants of broken units, but organized cells. Soviet forces, burdened by the task, labeled them elements, a convenient euphemism for enemies who refused to acknowledge defeat. They waged a relentless war against this insurgency within the rubble. This forgotten epilogue of Stalingrad, a symphony of desperation, stands as a stark contradiction to the accepted version. Consider the scale. Thousands of men, stripped of leadership, surrounded, facing insurmountable odds, refused to surrender. Suicide, a path of defiance, became a preferred alternative to the humiliation of defeat. These men, fueled by something beyond mere obedience, chose the oblivion of battle over the living death of captivity. Stalingrad, deservedly remembered as the watershed moment of the conflict, a testament to the limits of aggression, saw the tide decisively turn. The seemingly unstoppable advance, a swift, devastating assault, had been brought to a grinding, bloody halt. The dream of a swift conquest, of an easy victory in the east, lay buried beneath the pulverized concrete, entombed alongside the countless unburied bodies that marked the city's landscape. The hubris of ambition, choked by the unforgiving realities of war, found its final resting place. To comprehend the magnitude of this transformation, to grasp the full weight of what occurred in that ruined city, one must rewind. One must revisit the genesis of this cataclysm. June 1941. The invasion commenced, unleashing a mechanized onslaught that tore through the heart of the country with terrifying efficiency. Cities fell, populations were subjugated, the sprawling empire teetered on the verge of collapse. Yet, the cruel, inescapable winter, an adversary more formidable than any army, intervened, bringing the juggernaut to a shuddering halt on the outskirts of the capital. Supply lines, those vital arteries of war, froze, both literally and figuratively. By the spring of 1942, the war machine, ever adapting, unveiled a revised strategy. Abandoning the direct assault on the capital, a gamble was made in the south, a desperate lunge towards the vital resources nestled in the mountains, a gateway to the lifeblood of the Soviet nation. The army was cleaved into two colossal formations. One, the designated spearhead, thrust deep into the heart of the mountain range, seeking to seize the strategic reservoirs. The other, anchored by the formidable force, was tasked with advancing towards the life-giving river and the city that bore the name of the leader. This shift, a calculated risk, also triggered subtle yet significant changes far from the battlefield. Within the capital, a surge of public displays emerged. Citizens were reminded through posters and propaganda of distant allies, of support flowing in from across the oceans. Ships, laden with supplies, vital equipment, essential supplies, docked in Soviet ports. Nations, continents away, offered their support, buying precious time for the war-torn nation to regroup, to rebuild. A lifeline of international solidarity. Despite this infusion of aid, the High Command remained acutely aware of the challenge that lay ahead. The most disciplined and powerful land force ever assembled was closing in. Its unwavering focus was now fixed on a single, critical objective: the vital resources held within the mountains. Control of these resources would cripple the Red Army, grounding aircraft, immobilizing tanks, strangling the war effort at its source. The mountainous terrain presented a formidable obstacle, a natural fortress of unparalleled scale. Towering peaks, sheer cliffs, treacherous passes and icy trails rendered passage nearly impossible. A single road snaked through this unforgiving landscape, vulnerable to attack and easily severed. Beyond this lay the ultimate prize, the beating heart of the Empire's fuel supply. This was not merely a city, it was the energy depot, the fuel source for the entire war machine. The nation's tanks, trucks and aircraft depended on the product extracted from its depths. For the advancing armies, securing this resource was paramount. The only viable path lay along the western coast, a narrow corridor dangerously exposed. This strategic city sat squarely on the river, a massive artery that sustained the country. To control this artery was to choke the nation. Capturing the city would effectively sever the nation in two. Southern forces would be isolated. The flow of vital resources would be choked. The capital itself would be vulnerable to a southern flanking manoeuvre, a strategy of dominoes where one victory led to a complete collapse. But this strategy, so meticulously planned, soon began to unravel. Instead of securing the city intact, it was subjected to intense aerial bombardment. The city was turned into a wasteland, a sea of fire and shattered concrete. This show of force backfired spectacularly. The destruction created a maze of rubble, an urban hellscape that hampered the war machine. The devastation transformed the city into a haven for defenders. Snipers, sappers and infantry found shelter within the wreckage. Every wall became a barricade, every basement a bunker. By the end of August, the spearheads reached the outskirts. Initial resistance was uncoordinated, sporadic, yet remarkably resilient. The defending army, acutely aware of the city's importance, reinforced the city. Divisions were rushed across the river, braving constant bombardment. Even civilians were drawn into the defence: factory workers, students, the elderly. By September, the city was partially encircled, the noose was tightening. Yet, a vital corridor remained open, providing a lifeline for the defenders. Supplies were ferried across the river under the cloak of darkness, defying bombs and artillery shells. What followed was not war, it was slaughter. The front line dissolved. Combat became a brutal, close-quarters affair. The firepower and coordination, usually decisive advantages, were blunted by the rubble. Artillery, tanks and aircraft were often too dangerous to deploy. The struggle for the railway station is a prime example. Control shifted hands 14 times in a mere 6 hours, a testament to the level of brutality. Soldiers were consumed by the chaos. Units dwindled to mere remnants. Medics were unable to reach the wounded. Ammunition dwindled. Entire battalions disappeared into the smoke and debris. Yet, the defenders held. Order number 227, not one step back, was more than a command. It was a vow written in blood. Retreat was met with swift, brutal reprisal. Fear was a weapon, but so was survival. There was no escape. This was not just a battle, it was a crucible. By late autumn, the battlefield defied imagination. The city was a lifeless skeleton. Iconic structures were now gutted shells. Twisted machinery served as barricades. The ruins became a warren of ambushes, booby traps, and, most deadly of all, snipers. This wasn't a sideshow. It was a core element of the urban warfare. Masters of stealth and precision transformed the city into a killing field. Soldiers dreaded the sound of shattering glass, the glint of a scope. Every step became a gamble. The battle became a meat grinder, devouring men without yielding a decisive victory. After months of savage combat, the invaders controlled 90% of the city. But the cost had been immense. The advancing army had suffered crippling losses. Yet the High Command believed final victory was within reach. But while attention was focused on the ruins, the opposing command was implementing a larger plan. The enemy flanks were vulnerable. Rather than reinforcing the lines with elite units, the task of holding the vast flanks was delegated to allied troops from various nations. These men fought bravely, but they lacked the equipment, training, and supplies of their counterparts. Morale was low. Communication was chaotic. The north flank, a vast stretch of front, was entrusted to a thinly spread and poorly prepared force. The south flank faced similar vulnerabilities. These were not hardened divisions. They were infantry units holding open, frozen terrain, backed by outdated artillery. A massive counteroffensive was launched. The goal was not the city itself, but its vulnerable underbelly. Two pincers moved in, targeting the weakest formations. The attack was brutal, swift. The forces crumbled under the weight of the assault. Reserve forces scrambled to respond, but they were too few, too far away. Within days, the pincers met, completing the encirclement. A massive force was trapped within what became known as the pocket. Supplies dwindled, the winter closed in. Men burned furniture to stay warm. Wounds festered. Horses were slaughtered for meat. The aerial resupply was inadequate. Planes were lost daily. The commander pleaded for permission to withdraw, to link up with relief forces, but the request was denied. Retreat was unthinkable. Instead, the focus was a fantasy, the aerial resupply. But this plan was doomed. The aerial force was stretched thin. In reality, the supplies delivered were a fraction of what was needed. Conditions deteriorated rapidly. The army was fighting not just the enemy, but starvation, frostbite, and despair. The attempt to relieve the pocket failed. The distance was too far. Resistance was too fierce. The refusal to allow a breakout rendered the entire operation futile. Yet, reality was denied. Surrender was forbidden. The army was to hold out as a symbol of resolve. The battle became a political test. The army would fight to the last bullet, and so the men were left to die. The few airfields fell. The only relief came in the form of parachute drops, often inaccurate. Still, they fought, driven by brutal logic. The prospect of captivity was terrifying. After years of barbaric warfare, there was no sympathy. The roles were now reversed. The idea of dying slowly in a prison camp was terrifying enough to keep men fighting. It was better to die with a weapon in hand than to waste away. Another chance to surrender was offered, but orders were absolute. Contact was lost with the northern sector. There were thousands of wounded scattered throughout the ruins. But this was no longer a military problem. It was ideological. There would be no retreat, no surrender. As the anniversary of power approached, the commander was promoted. The symbolism was clear. No commander had ever surrendered. A clear signal to fight to the death. The end came with a collapse. The southern pocket disintegrated. The commander and his staff were captured. He did not take his own life. He submitted to capture. He refused to issue an order to surrender. That task fell to another commander. Isolated and surrounded, he forbade suicide. The message was clear: die fighting. Reality became impossible to ignore. The decision was now theirs: surrender, resist, or die. The last resistance officially ended, but not all surrendered. Some refused. Driven by desperation, they remained scattered in the ruins, outlaws to be hunted down. A ruthless operation commenced. The goal was to eliminate the last of the resistance. The so-called mopping up operations turned into weeks of bitter fighting. The Germans had become spectres. Reports continued to come in of stragglers attempting to escape. The NKVD ordered a full sweep. By the time the snow began to melt, reports stated that thousands had been captured. But even that figure is likely not the whole truth. Western historians have barely scratched the surface. The language barriers, bureaucratic obstacles, mean that much of this story remains buried. How many really stayed behind? It is highly plausible that the real number was far higher. And yet, these men have no place in the narrative. History books offer a clean ending. But the real end came weeks later, through gunfire in alleyways. There are no monuments for them. Their stories were swallowed by the ruins, and yet they were there. What stands out is a recurring theme: escape. Time and time again, soldiers wrote about comrades attempting to flee. There was no breakout plan, only survival. Some attempted to blend in with refugees, others waited until nightfall to sneak past patrols. How many tried? The truth is, we'll likely never know. The fog hides more than just bodies. It hides truths, motives. The numbers offer structure to the chaos, but they may also give us a false sense of completeness. How many stories never made it home? In the film, there's a powerful sequence where a group of soldiers discuss escaping the city. It shows exhausted, starving men contemplating the impossible. That scene has always stayed with me. How many tried and failed? The official history can tell us how many surrendered, but it can't tell us how many quietly slipped away, hoping to cheat death. The labyrinthine ruins of Stalingrad, a city devoured by war, had become a paradoxical sanctuary, a grim haven for those who refused to relinquish hope. Within its shattered architecture, amidst the skeletal remains of buildings that once housed lives and dreams, thousands of combatants sought refuge, their minds a battlefield as chaotic as the city itself. These were the forgotten, the uncounted, the ghosts of a defeated army. Consider the vastness of the urban wasteland, a sprawling network of collapsed structures, subterranean tunnels, and shattered infrastructure. Each cratered street, each bombed-out apartment block, each twisted girder offered a potential hiding place, a temporary reprieve from the relentless pursuit. The sheer scale of the devastation made a comprehensive search nearly impossible. The Soviets, despite their best efforts, could not possibly scour every nook and cranny. The ruins themselves seemed to conspire against them, concealing secrets within their fractured embrace. For the men who remained, survival was a moment-to-moment struggle, a constant negotiation with death. Food and water were scarce, forcing them to scavenge amidst the debris, competing with rats and stray dogs for scraps. The winter's icy grip tightened its hold, turning the ruins into a frozen purgatory. Frostbite gnawed at their extremities, hunger weakened their bodies, despair threatened to consume their minds. Yet, they endured. Driven by a potent cocktail of fear, defiance, and sheer animal instinct, they clung to life with a tenacity that defied logic. Some formed small ragtag groups, offering each other support and protection. They shared meagre rations, took turns keeping watch, and whispered stories of home to keep their spirits alive. Others preferred to operate alone, becoming solitary predators in the urban jungle. They moved like shadows, avoiding contact whenever possible, relying on their wits and their weapons to survive. The motivations behind their continued resistance were complex and varied. For some, it was a matter of ideology, a fanatical belief in their cause that refused to be extinguished. They saw themselves as warriors of an ideology, holding out against the tide of perceived oppression. For others, it was a matter of pride, a refusal to be humbled by defeat. They would rather die fighting than surrender to the enemy. But perhaps the most powerful motivator was fear, a primal terror of what awaited them in Soviet captivity. The stories of atrocities, of starvation and brutality in prison camps were widespread. Many believed that death in the ruins was a far more merciful fate than a slow, agonizing demise behind barbed wire. This fear, fueled by propaganda and personal experience, drove them to fight with a ferocity born of desperation. The Soviets, for their part, were determined to eliminate this lingering resistance. The NKVD, the state security apparatus, took the lead in the mopping-up operations. They deployed specialized units, trained in urban warfare, to systematically clear the ruins. These units were ruthless and efficient, employing a scorched-earth policy that left no hiding place unexposed. The fighting was brutal and unforgiving. Soviet troops armed with flamethrowers and grenades stormed basements and bunkers, flushing out the holdouts like rats. Snipers engaged in deadly duels, trading shots from rooftops and windows. Hand to hand, combat was frequent and savage, a desperate struggle for survival in the claustrophobic confines of the ruins. The Soviets often faced fierce resistance. The German soldiers, though weakened and outnumbered, fought with a desperate courage. They knew that their lives were on the line, and they were not going to surrender easily. They booby-trapped buildings, set ambushes, and used the terrain to their advantage. The sewers became a particularly dangerous battleground. The Germans used the underground tunnels to move around the city undetected, launching surprise attacks and disappearing back into the darkness. The Soviets responded by sending in small teams to explore the sewers, but they often encountered fierce resistance. The tunnels were dark, cramped, and filled with booby traps. The fighting was often hand-to-hand, a brutal and terrifying struggle in the pitch black. One particularly harrowing account describes a group of Soviet soldiers who were ambushed in the sewers. They had been tasked with clearing a section of tunnel when they stumbled upon a group of German soldiers who were hiding in the shadows. The Germans opened fire, killing several of the Soviet soldiers instantly. The remaining Soviet soldiers fought back, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. The fighting was intense and chaotic, with soldiers firing blindly into the darkness. Eventually, the Soviet soldiers were able to kill the Germans, but they suffered heavy casualties. The mopping-up operations continued for weeks, long after the official surrender. The Soviets gradually reduced the pockets of resistance, but the fighting was slow and costly. They had to clear every building, every basement, every sewer tunnel. The ruins of Stalingrad remained a dangerous place, a testament to the brutality of war and the tenacity of the human spirit. The numbers tell only part of the story. Soviet records indicate that thousands of German soldiers were killed or captured in the weeks following the surrender. But these figures do not account for those who simply disappeared, who were never found, who vanished into the ruins without a trace. It is likely that many of these men died of their wounds or of starvation. Others may have been killed by civilians, who were eager to take revenge on the invaders. Still others may have managed to escape the city, blending in with the local population or fleeing into the countryside. The fate of these missing soldiers remains a mystery. Their stories were lost amidst the chaos and destruction of Stalingrad. They became footnotes in history, forgotten victims of a forgotten war. But their presence lingers in the ruins, a haunting reminder of the human cost of conflict. Consider the psychological toll on both sides. The German soldiers trapped in the ruins faced constant fear and uncertainty. They were cut off from their comrades, their families, and their homeland. They had no idea when or if they would be rescued. They lived in a constant state of anxiety, waiting for the inevitable. The Soviet soldiers, too, were affected by the psychological trauma of the mopping-up operations. They were forced to fight in a nightmarish environment, surrounded by death and destruction. They had to kill men who were often desperate and starving. They had to witness horrific scenes of suffering and violence. The experience left many of them scarred for life. The ruins of Stalingrad became a breeding ground for trauma, a place where the line between sanity and madness blurred. Soldiers on both sides experienced hallucinations, nightmares, and flashbacks. They struggled to cope with the horrors they had witnessed. The psychological impact of the Battle of Stalingrad extended far beyond the battlefield. The war had a profound effect on the Soviet and German societies, leaving lasting scars on the national psyche. The Soviets emerged from the war with a renewed sense of national pride and a determination to rebuild their country. The Germans, on the other hand, were left with a deep sense of guilt and shame. They had to confront the horrors of their past and rebuild their society from the ashes of defeat. Stalingrad remains a potent symbol of the destructive power of war. It is a reminder of the human cost of conflict and the importance of striving for peace. The ruins of the city stand as a silent testament to the suffering and sacrifice of those who fought there. The story of the forgotten resistance in Stalingrad is a story of survival, defiance, and despair. It is a story of men who are pushed to the limits of human endurance. It is a story that deserves to be remembered. The individual stories, however fragmented, speak volumes. One account tells of a young sniper, barely out of his teens, who continued to fight for weeks after the surrender. He hid in the ruins of a department store, picking off Soviet soldiers one by one. He became a legend among the remaining German soldiers, a symbol of their unwavering resistance. Another account describes a group of engineers who used their skills to booby-trap buildings and create hidden tunnels. They turned the ruins into a deadly maze, inflicting heavy casualties on the Soviet forces. Still another account tells of a medic who risked his life to care for the wounded. He moved from bunker to bunker, tending to the injured and offering words of comfort. He was a beacon of hope in a sea of despair. These stories, though often fragmented and incomplete, offer a glimpse into the lives of the forgotten resistance. They reveal the courage, the resilience, and the humanity of these men. They remind us that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can endure. Beneath the ravaged surface of Stalingrad, a hidden world existed, a subterranean labyrinth that mirrored the chaos and desperation of the city above. The sewer system, once designed to carry waste and rainwater, now served as a refuge, a battleground, and a graveyard for the forgotten soldiers of the city. Here, in the perpetual darkness, a different kind of war raged, a war fought with whispers and shadows, with the stench of decay and the ever-present threat of ambush. Imagine descending into this underworld, leaving behind the faint glimmer of daylight and entering a realm of impenetrable blackness. The air is thick with the smell of sewage, stagnant water, and decomposing bodies. The tunnels are narrow and claustrophobic, forcing you to move in a hunched position. The ground is slick with slime and debris, making each step precarious. The sounds are amplified in the enclosed space. The dripping of water, the scuttling of rats, the distant echo of gunfire. Every creak and groan of the aging infrastructure sends a jolt of fear through your veins. You're not alone down here. The German soldiers who sought refuge in the sewers were a motley crew. Some were wounded, seeking shelter from the relentless bombardment. Others were deserters, hoping to escape the city and avoid capture. Still others were simply lost, separated from their units in the chaos of the fighting. Whatever their reasons for being there, they all shared a common goal: survival. They scavenged for food and water, built makeshift shelters, and tried to avoid contact with the Soviet forces who occasionally ventured into the tunnels. The Soviets, for their part, were determined to clear the sewers. They knew that the Germans were using the tunnels to move around the city undetected, launching surprise attacks and disappearing back into the darkness. They sent in small teams of soldiers to explore the sewers, but they often encountered fierce resistance. The fighting in the sewers was particularly brutal. The tunnels were dark, cramped, and filled with booby traps. The soldiers had to fight hand to hand, often in complete darkness. The stench of sewage and decay made the experience even more nauseating. One account describes a group of Soviet soldiers who were tasked with clearing a section of sewer tunnel. They had been crawling through the tunnel for hours, their bodies aching and their nerves on edge. Suddenly they heard a noise ahead of them. They stopped and listened. It sounded like someone was whispering. The Soviet soldiers crept forward, their weapons raised. They rounded a corner and saw a group of German soldiers huddled together in a small alcove. The Germans were startled by the sudden appearance of the Soviets. They scrambled to their feet and opened fire. The Soviet soldiers returned fire. The tunnel was filled with the sound of gunfire and the smell of gunpowder. The fighting was intense and chaotic. Soldiers were shouting and screaming, trying to get a better shot at the enemy. One of the Soviet soldiers was hit in the leg. He fell to the ground, writhing in pain. His comrades rushed to his aid, dragging him back around the corner. The fighting continued for several minutes. Finally, the Germans ran out of ammunition. They surrendered to the Soviet soldiers. The Soviet soldiers were exhausted and shaken, but they had accomplished their mission. They had cleared another section of the sewer tunnel. The sewers were not just a battleground, they were also a refuge for civilians. Many civilians had lost their homes in the fighting and were forced to seek shelter in the tunnels. They lived in squalor and fear, but they were grateful to have a place to hide from the bombs and the bullets. The German soldiers and the Soviet soldiers often encountered civilians in the sewers. Sometimes they would help them, sharing their food and water. Other times they would ignore them, focusing on their own survival. One account tells of a German soldier who found a young girl hiding in a sewer tunnel. The girl was terrified and starving. The soldier gave her some of his bread and water. He stayed with her for several hours, comforting her and telling her stories. He eventually left her, but he never forgot her. The sewers of Stalingrad were a microcosm of the war itself. They were a place of darkness, violence, and despair. But they were also a place of courage, compassion, and survival. The stories of the people who lived and fought in the sewers are a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Consider the psychological impact of living in such a confined and oppressive environment. The constant darkness, the foul odours, the lack of privacy, all took a toll on the mental health of the soldiers and civilians who were forced to live there. Many of them suffered from depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. They had nightmares and flashbacks. They struggled to cope with the horrors they had witnessed. The sewers became a breeding ground for mental illness. The darkness seemed to amplify the negative emotions, making it difficult for people to maintain their sanity. The survivors of the sewers emerged from the tunnels scarred, both physically and emotionally. They had witnessed the worst of humanity and had been forced to endure unimaginable suffering. They carried the burden of their experiences with them for the rest of their lives. The story of the sewers of Stalingrad is a story that deserves to be told. It is a story of the forgotten victims of war, the people who were forced to live in the shadows, the people whose stories were never recorded in the history books. Their experiences are a reminder of the human cost of conflict and the importance of striving for peace. The sewers of Stalingrad remain a symbol of the darkness and despair that war can bring. The Red October steelworks, a sprawling complex of factories and workshops, had once been the pride of Stalingrad, a symbol of Soviet industrial might. But by the winter of 1942, it had been transformed into a desolate landscape of shattered buildings, twisted metal, and unburied corpses. Here, amidst the ruins, the remnants of the German army waged a desperate battle for survival, their hopes dwindling with each passing day. Imagine standing amidst the wreckage of the Red October factory. The air is thick with the smell of smoke, burning metal, and decaying flesh. The ground is littered with debris, shattered bricks, twisted girders, spent ammunition, and human remains. The silence is broken only by the wind whistling through the broken windows and the occasional crackle of a distant fire. The Red October factory had been the site of some of the fiercest fighting in Stalingrad. The German and Soviet soldiers had battled for every building, every workshop, every machine. The factory had changed hands numerous times, each time leaving behind a trail of death and destruction. The German soldiers who remained in the Red October factory after the surrender were a mix of wounded deserters and diehards. They had no food, no water, and little ammunition. They were surrounded by Soviet forces and had no hope of escape. Yet they refused to surrender. They were determined to fight to the death, even if it meant dying amidst the ruins of the factory. The Soviet forces, for their part, were determined to eliminate the remaining German resistance. They launched a series of assaults on the Red October factory, using artillery, tanks, and infantry. The fighting was brutal and unforgiving. The German soldiers fought back with a desperate courage. They used the ruins of the factory to their advantage, setting ambushes and booby-trapping buildings. They inflicted heavy casualties on the Soviet forces. One account describes a group of German soldiers who were holed up in a machine shop. They had barricaded the doors and windows and were waiting for the Soviet forces to attack. The Soviet soldiers stormed the machine shop, firing their weapons as they advanced. The German soldiers returned fire. The machine shop was filled with the sound of gunfire and the smell of gunpowder. The fighting was intense and chaotic. Soldiers were shouting and screaming, trying to get a better shot at the enemy. One of the Soviet soldiers was hit in the chest. He fell to the ground, dying instantly. The remaining Soviet soldiers continued to advance. They eventually overwhelmed the German soldiers, killing them all. The machine shop was littered with dead bodies and spent ammunition. The fighting in the Red October factory continued for several weeks. The Soviet forces gradually reduced the German resistance, but the fighting was slow and costly. The ruins of the factory remained a dangerous place, a testament to the brutality of war. The Red October factory was not just a battlefield, it was also a graveyard. Thousands of soldiers, both German and Soviet, had died within its walls. Their bodies were buried amidst the rubble, their stories lost to history. The ghosts of the Red October factory still haunt the ruins today. Visitors to the factory have reported hearing strange noises and seeing shadowy figures. Some believe that the spirits of the dead soldiers are still trapped within the walls of the factory. The Red October factory remains a symbol of the horrors of war. It is a reminder of the suffering and sacrifice of those who fought there. The ruins of the factory stand as a silent testament to the destructive power of conflict. Consider the symbolic significance of the Red October factory. It was a symbol of Soviet industrial might, a testament to the success of the communist system. Its destruction was a blow to Soviet morale. The German soldiers who fought in the Red October factory were driven by a variety of motivations. Some were fanatical believers in the Nazi ideology. Others were simply trying to survive. They were all caught up in a war that they did not understand. The Soviet soldiers who fought in the Red October factory were fighting to defend their homeland. They were determined to drive the German invaders out of their country. They were willing to sacrifice their lives to achieve their goal. The Red October factory was a microcosm of the larger conflict between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. It was a battle between two ideologies, two cultures, two ways of life. The outcome of the battle would determine the fate of Europe. The story of the Red October factory is a story of courage, sacrifice, and despair. It is a story that deserves to be remembered. The ruins of the factory stand as a reminder of the human cost of war and the importance of striving for peace. The relentless Russian winter, an ally to the Soviet forces and a merciless adversary to the invading army, tightened its grip on Stalingrad. The temperature plummeted, turning the ruins into a frozen wasteland. The German soldiers, already weakened by hunger and exhaustion, now faced a new and deadly enemy, the bitter frost. Imagine the bone-chilling cold that permeated every aspect of life in the ruins. The temperature dropped far below freezing, turning the air into a biting, icy wind. The ground was covered in a thick layer of snow and ice, making movement treacherous. The buildings offered little protection from the elements. The German soldiers were ill-equipped to deal with the harsh winter conditions. Many of them lacked proper winter clothing, relying instead on thin uniforms that provided little insulation. They had no access to heated shelters. forced to huddle together in the ruins trying to stay warm. The cold had a devastating impact on the German soldiers. Frostbite was rampant, causing agonizing pain and permanent damage. Many soldiers lost fingers, toes, and even limbs to the cold. Hypothermia was also a major threat, leading to disorientation, confusion, and eventually death. The lack of food and water made the situation even worse. The German soldiers were already starving, and the cold weather increased their caloric needs. They had to scavenge for food and water, often risking their lives to find something to eat or drink. The snow made it difficult to find supplies. The roads were impassable, and the airfields were closed. The German soldiers were cut off from the outside world, left to fend for themselves in the frozen wasteland. One account describes a group of German soldiers who were trying to make their way to a nearby village in search of food. They had been walking for hours, their bodies aching and their faces numb with cold. Suddenly a blizzard struck. The wind howled and the snow fell thick and fast. The German soldiers lost their way, stumbling blindly through the storm. They were exhausted and disoriented, their hope dwindling with each passing moment. One of the soldiers collapsed in the snow. His comrades tried to help him up, but he was too weak to move. They left him lying in the snow, knowing that he would soon die. The remaining soldiers continued to trudge through the storm, their spirits broken. They eventually reached the village, but it was deserted. The villagers had fled, leaving behind their homes and their possessions. The German soldiers searched the village for food, but they found nothing. They were exhausted, starving, and freezing. They collapsed in the snow, waiting for death to come. The winter of 1942 was a turning point in the Battle of Stalingrad. The German soldiers, weakened by hunger, exhaustion, and the bitter frost, were no match for the Soviet forces. The tide of the battle turned in favour of the Soviets, and the German army was eventually defeated. The winter of 1942 remains a symbol of the horrors of war. It is a reminder of the suffering and sacrifice of those who fought in Stalingrad. The frozen wasteland stands as a silent testament to the destructive power of conflict. Consider the psychological impact of the winter on the German soldiers. The constant cold, the lack of food, the isolation, all took a toll on their mental health. Many of them suffered from depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. The winter seemed to amplify the negative emotions, making it difficult for them to maintain their sanity. They had nightmares and flashbacks. They struggled to cope with the horrors they had witnessed. The survivors of the winter emerged from the ruins scarred, both physically and emotionally. They had witnessed the worst of humanity and had been forced to endure unimaginable suffering. They carried the burden of their experiences with them for the rest of their lives. The story of the winter of 1942 is a story that deserves to be told. It is a story of the forgotten victims of war, the people who were forced to endure unimaginable suffering, the people whose stories were never recorded in the history books. Their experiences are a reminder of the human cost of conflict and the importance of striving for peace. The frozen wasteland of Stalingrad remains a symbol of the darkness and despair that war can bring. The guns fell silent. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the ruins of Stalingrad in a shroud of white. The battle was over. The German army had been defeated. The Soviet forces had triumphed. But for the thousands of German soldiers who remained hidden in the ruins, the war was not yet over. These were the forgotten, the uncounted, the ghosts of a defeated army. They were wounded, starving, and exhausted. They had no hope of rescue, no chance of escape. They were surrounded by Soviet forces and left to fend for themselves in the frozen wasteland. They had a choice to make: surrender or continue to resist. Some chose to surrender, hoping for a chance to survive. Others chose to resist, determined to fight to the death. Those who surrendered were taken prisoner by the Soviet forces. They were marched to prison camps where they were subjected to harsh conditions and forced labour. Many of them died in captivity, succumbing to disease, starvation, or exhaustion. Those who chose to resist were hunted down by the Soviet forces. They were flushed out of their hiding places and killed. Their bodies were left to rot in the ruins, their stories lost to history. The silence that descended on Stalingrad was not a silence of peace, but a silence of death. It was a silence that spoke of the suffering, the sacrifice, and the despair of those who had fought and died in the city. The ruins of Stalingrad remained a dangerous place for years after the battle. Unexploded bombs, booby traps, and landmines littered the landscape. The bodies of the dead lay buried amidst the rubble, contaminating the soil and the water. The city was slowly rebuilt, but the scars of war remained. The memories of the battle lingered in the minds of those who had survived. The ghosts of Stalingrad continued to haunt the ruins, a constant reminder of the horrors of war. Consider the legacy of the Battle of Stalingrad. It was a turning point in the war, marking the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. It was also a symbol of the resilience of the Soviet people, who had endured unimaginable suffering and emerged victorious. The Battle of Stalingrad had a profound